Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Data Sense Podcast. This is the show where you learn from technical and business leaders how to connect business and data to develop your own ability or sense to use data to drive your business forward. Today we have Greg Powell. Greg has been working as a senior solutions architect for Amazon Web Services, or AWS for short. He has been working at AWS for almost 6 years. He has 20 years of experience in technology, and he runs a YouTube channel specifically dedicated to teaching AWS cloud computing and cloud computing principles in general. Welcome to the show, Greg. So, Greg, tell us about your journey into AWS and cloud computing. What got you into it, and where did you start?
Okay, well, I've been in tech for quite a long time, specifically as it relates to AWS. I started thinking about cloud very seriously back in 2015. Prior to 2015, I used to admire AWS from afar, the reInvent conferences on YouTube videos. I used to watch those. And I'd gotten into a project at a job in 2015, and the particular client I was working with, they had a decision as to whether or not they were going to go to cloud or just keep doing business as usual and throw it in the data center. And I made the case that it was going to be more advantageous to go to the cloud. The client at the time decided to go quite the opposite way and renew and refresh tech equipment to extend the data center equipment for another 3 to 5 years. And at that point, I was like, you know what? I think I'm done with data center. And I, at that point, aggressively started preparing for my cloud certifications. And for me, there was no other choice other than AWS to select because my mind was already made up. And in 2016 is when I started my career at AWS. And it's been an amazing 6 years. I just hit my 6-year anniversary here, June 13th. And yeah, it's been quite the ride. So that's just kind of a snapshot of how I kind of got into AWS.
Yeah, so AWS is definitely the market leader, has the biggest market share, and obviously it's been around for much longer. It's much more mature. Yes. With AWS, what's your particular? What would you say is your expertise? And within that, is it say Kubernetes? Is it the serverless stuff? Is it the just the virtual machines? Because even that is quite, although Kubernetes is the new thing, right? But with virtual machines, so many businesses are still on that, and they still need a lot of help dealing with them. They still have to use those. So yeah, what's your main go-to area?
Yes, so I am a generalist solutions architect at AWS, and specifically now the segment that I support are startups in the SoCal area as well as the Bay Area. So as a generalist solutions architect, as you would imagine, I'm covering the full realm of AWS solutions. And we're currently at, I think, 200 plus solutions as it stands now. So yeah. They're also specialist solutions architects as well, where they deep dive into one particular area. But I'm covering the platform as a whole. Now, kind of where my superpowers exist is I'm able to look at what my customers are trying to achieve and work backwards from there to figure out how I need to structure the Lego blocks, as I call them, to build a solution, help them architect a solution to help them achieve the business outcomes. That can range from many different things, whether it's data lakes or AI and ML, or trying to figure out how to modernize an application and unpack a monolith into a microservices-based application. Those are just some of the high-level things that I'm dealing with. And my roadmap in terms of where I'm spending a lot of my time is largely mapped to a couple different areas. One, first and foremost, is what my customers are trying to achieve, and then I need to figure out, okay, how can I apply my skills to help my customers do that? And then the second part is just where my natural interests are kind of taking me, and I kind of marry those up together to stay sharp, as I like to call it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so one thing, a few things I really like about AWS are the Lambda functions. They're just robust in terms of what they're able to do and deliver. Join it up with a few services. They just become you basically have a full application just by using Lambda functions and say S3 and glue. Just a few things. Do you have some favorites in terms of, say, with startups, obviously they're trying to save costs, and sometimes they are in a very early stage anyway, so they don't have a very heavy tech stack anyway. So what would you recommend? Do you have a particular preference in terms of, is it Lambda functions or is it, say, Docker containers? What would you go with?
Yeah, so I would say startups that are just starting their journey and born in the cloud, I would steer my startups towards serverless and a combination of containers. Right. So the conversation usually isn't, should we go serverless or should we go containers? It's an and, not an or. Right. So as you mentioned, startups are very cost conscious. Even beyond startups, most customers these days are cost conscious given the recession that we're in the midst of, and it's always good to trim the fat. So what's good with serverless, in Lambda in particular, is that it's event-based computing. Yeah. So certain actions trigger certain events that are tied to functions or Lambda functions. Yeah. These Lambda functions have little bits of code that perform certain functions, and when those functions are complete, that compute cost suspends, and it's paid for what you use, and then that billing kind of stops on that. Where containers comes into play is that containers squeeze out a higher level of abstraction of the underlying infrastructure. So instead of allowing EC2, which is the last elastic compute cloud, to become the primitive or the building block, which is a great service, by the way. I have lots of customers that still use that for many different use cases. Containers running on the infrastructure gives you a higher level of abstraction to squeeze out more utilization on that underlying infrastructure. And you can also have more agility and speed with containers, because EC2 instances, they take, a couple minutes or more to spin up, whereas containers are measured in seconds to spin up. So that's great there.
Yeah, what's really interesting about AWS is that there's so many ways of actually hosting containers, and one of my really favorite ways, or I would say like a really interesting way, is AWS Fargate. It's like it sort of marries the serverless and Docker containerization into a very interesting package. So that's pretty interesting. What would you say about with cost? What would you say is the biggest challenge in terms of that your customers are facing when it comes to cloud? I mean, you have one sort of customers who are obviously born on the cloud, right? They're like digital first, cloud first, remote first. With those, what's the challenge? What's the biggest challenge they face?
Some of the biggest constraints. Well, it kind of varies. I'm in the startup space, so from a general standpoint, time, funding, and skill level, and kind of the number of full-time employees that my startup customers can amass to get the challenges done. It depends on each individual startup, where they are in their round of funding, how much runway they have in terms of their burn rate, in terms of how much money they've invested. That's one thing. Startup customers are usually, they don't have hundreds of engineers, so they have to make very deliberate and intentional decisions in terms of their roadmap, what features and releases should they go after, and it's all about prioritization. So these are some of the kind of the trends and constraints that I see amongst my startup customers.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. And what would you say about say, if you have established customers, you must have worked with bigger companies, and obviously they have a bigger, they have at least in terms of funding, they don't have that problem. They have different problems. Right. What would you say with those?
So I'd also work with startups that are very well funded and have a number of engineers. But what's interesting is sometimes startups are so successful that they have to get out in front of becoming what I call a victim of their own success. Yeah. So when your startup is just kind of in that early stage and they're building out a minimal viable product, they might not take as long-term of a view as they should, because their focus is to crank out an MVP that has some baseline functionality so they can prove out to their investors, hey, we got something that works here. They can get, establish a feedback loop with their customers and then iterate there. That particular framework in the early stages may not hold water 1 to 2 years down the line. So sometimes when I get involved, depending on what stage I inherit a customer at, sometimes they've already gone through that MVP phase. They're growing super fast and things have gotten kind of crazy. Now they need to take a step back and to figure out, is the architecture that they initially built, will it scale? And if not, what kind of adjustments and optimizations can we make to make sure that the application continues to scale? So I would say that's probably a trend I see for some of the later stage startups, is to, yes, it's great, we're successful now. Now, how do we continue to scale? And one of those things oftentimes is building out, for example, like a multi-tenant SaaS-based architecture. And oftentimes when if they started out in, let's say, a North American market, now there's interest in expanding globally. And with that, there comes some additional architectural complexities, all things that can be solved, but do take some engineering due diligence to figure out.
Yeah. So what you just mentioned is pretty interesting. So one thing I've seen with startups is where if they have too much money, it's the issue is that everything is seen as, okay, how do we solve this with money? How do we solve that with money, right? Let's throw more money here, throw more money there, and hopefully it should just solve. Whereas sometimes you do need that bootstrapping mindset. You do need to sort of look into how we can try. Well, how would we solve that problem if we didn't have money? So that is definitely something to think about. One thing I would say is that with you mentioned changing. So do you say that often where, say, startups initially they had one way of doing things, right? They might have a couple of Lambda functions here and there, and once they get good funding, once they have proven their MVP, they are ready to move to bigger sort of architecture. Do they change their? I mean, obviously they have to change. They are hiring more engineers, but how much do they change, or if they change, what's your view on that?
Cloud affords you the ability to either persevere or pivot. In these uncertain times with the recession, especially if you're a startup customer, sometimes you definitely need to pivot. So I've had customers that have started off with, let's say, EC2 stack, an Elastic Compute Cloud, and then they realize, and for them to gain more agility and to be more competitive and to kind of enter like a DevOps CI/CD pipeline type of architecture, now they need to optimize and upgrade. And that's where they'll look at, okay, let's look at containers. So there is some underlying work that needs to be done, but as long as there are enough, full-time employees and or partners and or skill level on the team, these are things that can definitely be accomplished.
Cool. With that, do you see that often? Do you see many startups going through that journey where they start with one architecture and then they go to another architecture completely, or do they slowly evolve from one to another?
I see probably two ends of the spectrum. The first one I'll talk about, which I don't like to see, but it's sometimes how things are kind of put together. I'll have startup customers that I'm working with where it feels like they've cobbled things together based on their constrained resources. Now, when things are built like this, it's usually given a constraint, not because there weren't better choices. This is just a byproduct of how much time, money, and resources were on tap at the time, as well as skill level. Sometimes it's if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail type of thing. Yeah. So we'll solve for everything given this. And that's usually a constraint of the skill level on the team and not a byproduct of the availability of services. You know, over in AWS Cloud, there's a concept of the right tool for the right job, but we have to have somebody that that knows how to use the tools. So with startups, if they are constrained, one way to kind of overcome these architectures that need to be modified is to augment their capability for example, a partner. We can do it that way. So that's kind of the first scenario. It's definitely fixable. The second solution is what I like to see, where a startup or a customer has had a vision from the very beginning. They have a roadmap that stretches out, let's say, around 3 years or so for aspirational, what they would like to do. And then they start day one chipping away, aligning resources towards that goal, and work on the MVP, get the customer feedback through that feedback loop, fail fast when they need to, pivot if necessary based on feedback, and then step by step, brick by brick, work towards that roadmap.
Cool.
That's the ideal situation.
Cool. That makes sense. With that, when you are obviously dealing with costs, do you often get where the CFO gets on the call and is like trying to ask what's going on here? Why is the bill so high? Do you have those sort of questions? Do you have that sort of discussion?
Yeah. Interestingly enough, in the startup world, that doesn't happen quite as much. Now, before startups, I used to support enterprise customers. And in the enterprise world, that did come up from time to time. And the way I address that is through cost optimization exercises. Cloud is great, and you can definitely save money in the cloud, but you have to have mechanisms in place to do so. Yeah. Starting off with simple things like right-sizing the workload and not over-provisioning resources. And the way you kind of work through this is you do benchmarks to figure out what is the right set of resources that we need to be on. You benchmark through metrics to figure out, okay, wait a minute, we're over-provisioned, these types of things. The other thing that you can address is shutting off resources when they're not in use. Very specific things like deleting unused snapshots, eliminating data transfer out by enabling VPC endpoints. I don't want to get too specific, but there's an underlying, the symptom of a bill being too high is just a clue to a more systemic problem. And that systemic problem is there usually aren't cost optimization mechanisms in place. Yeah. And then that's when I work with my customers very closely to figure out how we can fix that for them.
Yeah, and what's really interesting with cost optimization is AWS has budgets. So you can create budgets in terms of, say, if the budget is like $1,000 or pounds, and you can set alerts on percentage, right? You can set alerts based on if it has reached 50%, give me an email or even a text message. If it has reached 80%, give me an email, text message as well. Or maybe, and now you inform two people, maybe the CFO as well as the CEO, if it's a small company, or as you mentioned, a large company.
That's right.
What's really interesting, and then what's really amazing about AWS is you have actions, you have budget actions. So suppose a startup is in its really early stages and they have really tight budget. And what really matters is they don't go over that budget, and they really definitely don't need to, have 100% or 99% uptime. They could set budgets and then set budget actions. So it's like a kill switch where if it does go above, $2,000, then something is really wrong and it should not. You can simply just kill it, and that's pretty interesting. That's really cool. Have you had the chance of like using that or like advocating? What would you say about that?
Yeah, I have customers that are using a number of things to mitigate that. One of the solutions I used to recommend was called the EC2 Instance Scheduler. And this would stop EC2 instances or pause RDS workloads as well. And then AWS Budgets has some tooling built in to kind of mitigate some things as well. So yes, these are all definitely things that I've worked with customers with in the past to help them spin down resources that are not in use, and in particular where there's oftentimes a lot of efficiencies that can be gained for cost are in development workloads. Do we need a development environment up and running at 2-3 o'clock in the morning?
Yeah.
So these are opportunities for us to spin things down. As I mentioned earlier, being able to pause an RDS instance where you still pay for the snapshot and storage, but you let go of the compute costs. And these are just some amazing things that back in the days of data center, when you bought something, that was it.
Yeah.
So being able to take a database and turning it down and not paying for it, not to mention Aurora Serverless, and that's scaling up and scaling down, and the cost associated with that based on how much performance you need or when you don't need any. So a number of different innovations there that you can address the costs, both from an architecture standpoint as well as programmatically with things like compute savings plans and reserve instances and those types of things. And let's not forget EC2 spot instances. That's a whole nother bag of cookies and donuts that we could go into. Yeah,
and what's really, as you mentioned, what's really amazing about the cloud and AWS Cloud in particular is that you can obviously change your infrastructure. You can start with, say, just a few Lambda functions, and then you can sort of scale up, I guess, a little bit to including containers as well. And then you can create an even more robust architecture. You could create the whole backend in just Lambda functions and then have a few microservices in containers, and that just makes sense. That is the beauty of cloud, whereas obviously a data center or what we call in the UK is like a on-prem service, right? On-prem, you have to go and buy the servers, upgrade the servers yourself, and then have a room where you have good security as well as aircon and all those things. So it's a lot of things you have to manage yourself. And when the IT guy goes on holiday, then someone has to stay there because that's when most of the problems occur. It's like
exactly.
It's like the IT guys have to be massaging the machine, like just to make sure it's working fine.
Interestingly enough, I've noticed that sometimes, like major U.S. holidays and stuff, you're like, you can just be using regular services that we consume as consumers, and you're like, wait a minute, why is this slow? Or what is this? This is a weird error. And then you're like, okay, yep, it's July 4th, makes sense now. Or like, or it's Thanksgiving Day, that type of thing. Yeah, so I know what you mean.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it just makes sense to be on the cloud and using the right sort of services.
Yeah. Yeah. To your point though, back in the days of data center and people going on vacation and kind of things going, up in smoke. With the cloud, there's a lot of automations you can put in place and a lot of automated guardrails. So when something goes bump in the night, by the time you wake up to see the email, the architecture is already self-remediated and self-healed itself. So that's some of the beauty of cloud now.
Yeah. So actually, just talking about that, where once I actually was implementing a solution where I sort of implemented, with some cars have these run flat tires, right? Where they can run
Yeah.
for 15 miles or something extra,
Yes. Yes.
even after having a flat. So that sort of thing where, obviously so many services are consuming APIs, external APIs, and external APIs are always have the problem of the schema change. And schema changes, it's going to go break your pipelines, ETL pipelines or whatever. And well, one thing I did engineer was basically whatever the schema is, we will infer from that. But first of all, we'll get whatever the data is, put it into S3. Once it's in S3, we'll process it out. Process it based on the whatever the schema is, and if it changes, then it will process out to a new table so that the old one doesn't break, or the new one is not saying it's not matching with the old one. And then when I get time to it, I will basically go and see what has happened and then put them together and resolve the issues. But so that's pretty cool, and that's obviously one of the amazing things about just using the cloud native tools.
Yes, definitely. Not to mention, you can stand up your lower test and dev environments kind of in parallel, and then test things out, and then focus on promoting those releases into prod. So it's great because there used to be like a lot of contention in the data center world where you invest all this capital expense into all this equipment, and you had all these teams sharing the same load. But with cloud, you can just throw some infrastructure as code templates together, either Terraform or CloudFormation, spin up these parallel-like environments, and run these tests without burdening the production environments.
Yeah. Once I was working with the Ordnance Survey. It's a maps company in the UK. They produce really amazing maps. And what's really interesting about their dev setup, or their whole tech setup, was that they had whole bit of Terraform code just to spin up a whole new environment for just one branch. So for each branch, so one prod obviously has its own branch, master branch, right, or main branch, and then all the other sort of feature branches would get their own infrastructure, and as soon as the branch is done, the infrastructure would just destroy itself. And that was just amazing. That's like, you can't do that with on-prem. It's like creating a branch, and then all of a sudden you have so much infrastructure in place. So, and that's obviously with Terraform. It's just so easy, so straightforward, and it takes less than half an hour to get that up and running.
Exactly, absolutely right. Not to mention, you can also version control your templates, so it's very sophisticated. And I was I think I saw a comment on one of my social posts the other day. I was talking about Terraform, and the person was talking about how much they love it, and their infrastructure was spinning up while they're adding cream and sugar to their coffee and sipping on that. Their entire environment was building in the background while they were just kind of sitting in the chair enjoying their coffee.
Yeah. What would you? Yeah. I have another question, and now, what would you say with all of this technology? Where is it heading, and what would you like to see that in AWS or in cloud computing that isn't around right now? And what would you say is, or maybe it's working ways of working. What is it? One thing that you would like to see?
Okay. So in my opinion, I think AI and ML is going to continue to grow, to continue to be integrated into many services to further remove what I call undifferentiated heavy lifting. So some of the mundane tasks that folks have to do now that might not be as glorious, AI and ML will continue to onboard into those services and remove some of that undifferentiated heavy lifting. What else? In terms of what would I like to see, I would say there'll probably also be a shift from a mixture of providing very sophisticated services that do a range of particular things. I'll call those bricks, and there'll also be more sophisticated services that I would say would be kind of a combination of bricks, kind of like a wall. So customers, I see, would have the opportunity to continue to build things, based on their own vision, and then there'll be managed services which remove and unburden a lot of customers to be able to use managed services so they can focus more on innovation. So yeah, that's some of the things that, in my opinion, I see things would shift to that area.
And so does that mean that it would be more towards serverless and containerization, where some sort of all they have to worry about is code or the logic, right? And then the rest of it will take care of itself, cost optimized automatically, stuff like that. Is that what you're advocating?
Yeah, that's the world I'm advocating for. And just if you see how things are kind of trending, how AI and ML is at the forefront, which enables these possibilities to just remove as much burden and undifferentiated heavy lifting as you can from a customer so that they can spend the majority of their time no longer worrying about the infrastructure. We're just focusing on pure innovation in terms of what sets them apart in their market, fuel them and empower them to disrupt their market, and ultimately delight their customers.
Yeah. What's really amazing about AI is with tools like GitHub Copilot, it's really amazing in terms of suggesting code or suggesting the right syntax. So now you don't have to Google the right syntax, right? You don't have to Google the right sort of snippet of code you need. You can sort of just type it, and it'll basically sort of Google it for you and suggest that really quickly, faster than IntelliSense or any sort of that sort of tool, and better than any sort of suggestion tools that has existed before. And obviously that's powered with AI. And I think that it just makes sense. It's the right sort of thing, right sort of future. What I would like to see, in AWS and just cloud computing in general, and I think I can definitely see that it's the right sort of approach, and it goes with what you're mentioning as well, is the how AI can be used to optimize solutions, but also to say debug, right? So suppose something goes wrong, right? We have to go up and open up CloudWatch and then look at the logs, and then maybe open up Kinesis, open up the logs. We have to open up some other service and see the logs there. Maybe see the S3 logs in CloudWatch and see what has happened. And it takes a while. It takes a while to sort of track back where the error occurred. Now the thing is that those sort of steps are pretty much you can see this is an error. Okay, now I'm going to go back to the previous error, which it's referring to. Go back to that service, and so on so. And you can see which service it's connected to. And I can see that AI could do that, where it tracks back right to the code. And suppose the code is you can also host it on AWS anyway, and you host the code and it tells you, well, the mistake is in this particular line. This line is returning too many issues, and this is the suggestion. And it says, do you want us to put the solution in place? And you press yes, and it goes and trickles it down, and all the problems are like totally gone. So that's the sort of future, I think, and I think it's actually possible in the next 2 to 3 years. It's not even difficult.
Oh yeah, it's going to be a good time to be a software engineer.
Yeah.
Just recently, to your point, there was a AWS service that was announced not too long ago. It's called Code Whisperer, and it integrates with the IDE. And if you're fat finger some code or something, or mistype some syntax, it catches it kind of there in real time. So to kind of minimize you introducing bugs into the code or kind of troubleshooting proactively. So, and that's, of course, as you mentioned, AI driven. So yeah, it's exciting times.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. That's definitely true. AI powering infrastructure optimization, cost optimization, and finding error bugs in code. right when they are being, either put in place or when they actually hit the infrastructure and when it's running, and then it debugs the code and tells you that's where the problem is, and you can just go and fix it right there and then. You don't have to struggle with so much debugging. That's the sort of thing which I can definitely see happening soon.
That's right.
This is we're coming to the sort of end of the podcast. What would you like to promote? Any personal projects you're working on. I understand you're working on a YouTube channel, and that's really cool. Tell us more about that.
Cool. Yes, a couple things here. Now I'm at the stage in my career where I get a lot of fulfillment on helping others. So one of the things I've learned as a solution architect over the last 6 years is that I've needed to figure out how I scale myself, how I can reach more people, and how I can do more with with the amount of energy that I can put out. So I'm very active on LinkedIn. You can look me up on there. Just Greg Powell. Google Greg Powell, AWS. I mean, I'm usually the first search result that pops up. As you mentioned, I'm building out the YouTube channel. YouTube is a long-term play to build a platform to teach others about AWS, but not just a tutorials-based YouTube channel. There will definitely be some videos walking through services and things, but also something unique that maybe not quite be out there as much, like, what's it like being a solution architect, things like breaking into tech, because what I've noticed is in a lot of the content I've created, I have a lot of folks reaching out to me. They're either students or maybe they're experienced hires that have been in the working world for a while, not necessarily in tech, and they're looking to retwistle their career, type of thing like that. So I'm working on that. And the last thing I would mention is also on TikTok. I just crossed, at the time of the recording of this podcast, 10,000 followers on TikTok here just recently. And that's been a lot of fun. And that is a AWS Cloud focused channel that I'm just taking the knowledge and insights I've gained over the years, reaching a pretty huge audience and continuing to grow. So I am Thoughtful Techie Cloud on the YouTube channel, and over on TikTok, Thoughtful Techie _Cloud. That's where you can find me.
Cool, perfect. Lastly, thank you for being on the show. It was really great to have you here.
Yes. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.